first thing before I do anything on the scene is to make sure the scene is safe. I'm also going to make sure that I have my appropriate PSI on applied, which I do now. Another part of the scene survey is to check for any hazards, weather hazards, anything that might hinder either the extraction or treatment that I may have to do while in the field with this patient. The other part of the scene size up is to determine whether or not there's any bystanders. If there are, we can use them to collect, use for history taking, maybe give us a little bit more information on how we may have to treat this patient or what has happened to this patient. I'm going to determine the mechanism of injury. This patient appears to have been thrown from a vehicle. Other general impression, he's a male, appears to be 30 years of age. It's part of the general impression of the patient. After I conclude my scene size up and my general impression of the patient, I'm going to start my hands-on portion of the assessment. Before doing anything, because of the mechanism of injury, it would be essential to make sure that I have an assistant control his neck, C-spine, to make sure I don't do any further injury to this patient. Once my assistant has his airway, or not his airway, I'm sorry, has his C-spine controlled, I'm going to check this patient's airway. I'm going to use my pen light, and I can also use a jaw thrust technique, which is something like that, in order to see inside to see if there's anything obstructing this patient's airway. I would then treat if there was anything obstructing this patient's airway. I'm also going to look for if this patient aspirated on itself, and I would note that, and I would make sure to let medical know once I get to whatever facility I'm taking this patient. Once my patient also has that C-spine, that's very important. I've checked this patient's airway for breathing, and I've treated the way is appropriate. I'm going to check this patient's circulation. I'm going to check his auxiliary, and I'm also going to check his auxiliary, and I'm also going to check his carotid arteries, his extremities. I want to make sure they both have a pulse. Once I've gotten this patient's pulse, I'm going to notate that in the vitals. Continuing on after that, I'm going to assess this patient's level of consciousness using AVPU. That acronym stands for alertness, visual or verbal stimuli, pain stimuli, and unconscious. One of the ways so the first way is I'm going to check to see if this patient is even conscious or not. Alert, if he's alert. Checking for verbal stimuli, I'm going to say, try to communicate with this patient, see if he can understand me and if he's reactive to that. Pain stimuli, I'm going to pinch his earlobes or the meaty part of his neck to see if he reacts to that. And then it's whether this patient is just completely unconscious. Now I'm going to proceed to the hands-on portion of this assessment. I would do a chunk test, and I'm going to just check to see if there's any bleeding. I'm going to start on his head. I'm going to check my gloves. I'm going to also check for any deformities, contusions, abrasions, punctures, penetrations, burns, tenderness, lacerations, swelling. That's what I'm doing when I'm checking every part of his body, pretty much. So I'm checking his head, checking the back of his neck. I'm going to check his trachea, make sure that part of his neck is good, and if it's not, then I would treat in the appropriate manner. I'm going to check the back of his neck. Then I'm going to check his chest. I would also expose this patient before doing so, and I'm going to check this patient's sternum. I'm just going to push down, once again checking for deformities. I'm going to check his, see if he has any bilateral chest rising, and then I would also check this patient's respirations at this time. I'm checking his ribs, checking, you know, all of that. Once I get to his abdomen, I'm going to check every quadrant of this patient's abdomen, seeing if he reacts to any of that, with it being tender or, once again, everything. I'm checking my gloves to make sure there's no bleeding. Then once I get to the pelvis, I'm not going to push down, I'm going to push in on this patient's pelvis, make sure it's stable. And then, once again, I'm going to expose this patient's legs, and I'm going to checking for blood on my gloves. I'm going to go down each leg. I'm going to check his dorsal pulse, see if there's a pulse there, see if there's any injuries, and then I would treat accordingly. Now, once that is conducted, I'm going to go back up to the arms. I'm going to check the arms for any bleeding, blood, any swelling. If there's any arm that is larger than the other arm due to swelling, check the pulse again. Once I finish that part of the assessment, I'm going to determine the level of severity of this patient, and whether I'm going to stay and play, or whether I'm going to get out of here as quickly as possible, because we can't do anything to help him. He needs to get to the hospital. Then I'm going to check his eyes. I'm going to use the pearl to see, make sure that his pupils are the same size. Make sure they're equal and round. See if they react to the light using my pen light. I'm then going to check this patient's ears for any fluid or blood. I'm going to check the back of the ears for any battle scars. Once I do that, just hopefully my assistant is here with the longboard. I would log roll this patient. I'm going to log roll this patient. Once I do that, I'm going to check his back for anything else, any blood, abrasions, all of that. Make sure there's no more trauma. That longboard would be placed underneath this patient. I'm going to roll the patient back onto that board. He's going to get strapped in, and then we're going to move this patient to the ambulance, where we're going to conduct the secondary part of my assessment.